thanks for coming along. We're pleased to see a good full room. Hopefully a very interesting couple of presentations coming up. But just by way of introduction to us, I'm John Kay from E.H. Smith. I'm a fellow here at the RSA. And also to introduce you to the RSA, some of you will probably know more about it than I do, but we'll give it a bash. So the RSA building that we're in has been around since the 1700s. 1776 this building was constructed. But its history goes back an awful lot longer than that, especially where you're sat. If you looked when you came in, just at the back of the room, there is a 2,000-year-old Roman road. Which used to be the road coming out of the city, heading to Silchester, which I had to Google the other day, is one of the finest Roman settlements left preserved in the UK, over near Basingstoke, and that was a main thoroughfare, and you're actually sitting on it. Obviously London was a little bit different then, or Londinium, and the Strand was quite a long way out of the city. But in the 1700s, when this building was built, it was obviously already a large and thriving city. That's a map from just before this building was built. We are here. Again, you can see things have changed somewhat. The planners there have done their work. Where we are in the vaults actually used to be storage facilities for goods coming in off the Thames. So when you're down there later on, when we got our refreshments, just imagine what it would have been like 300 years ago, full of cows and sheep, because that's what they used to keep down there. Somewhat different today. So this building was designed by two fellows of the RSA, who were Robert and James Adam back in the 1700s. Other fellows, notable ones, have included Charles Dickens, Adam Smith, who was the father of free market economics, Benjamin Franklin, one of the founding fathers of the USA. There's a room upstairs dedicated to him, Karl Marx, and moving a bit more up to date, Stephen Hawking and Sir Tim Berners-Lee, amongst many others. President currently is the Princess Royal. So James and Robert Adam, 1774, had something called the Adelphi Project. Here they are. Architects' fashions have changed a little since then, we're glad to see. Not much. Okay. There we go, fighting talk. And Robert Adam, this one here, was architect of the King's Works. So he was responsible for quite a number of buildings in and around central London. This building was part of something called the Adelphi Project, as I said, which was this. So all of this building here was on the front, and again the goods came in and into these entrances, which would have ended up into the vaults. So again, as you can see, things have changed. The Adelphi building that I'm sure you all know and love, the Art Deco building, just out the front of this building, was built on top of where that site is. So there you go, there's our whistle-stop history tour of the room in the building that you sat in. Now a whistle-stop history of E.H. Smith. Now that's going to be a bit quicker. Oh, there's your vaults. So E.H. Smith were one of the largest independently owned building materials distributors in the country, and one of the largest specialists in brick, so you can see why we love this place. We've got a specialist team, some of which are here today, who work with architects to help select materials on projects, and we've been doing that for quite some time. Our history in London dates back to the 1920s. So we've got a heritage there, not quite matching the heritage of here, but we're giving it a good shot. Projects a little bit later when we go down for food. We've been involved, many of you in this room, we thank you. our website has, I think, 170 odd case studies of projects, a lot of which are in London that we have had our small piece of involvement with, and of course we would be delighted to have involvement in any more. That's the advert. And also thanks to the guys from IG, who again, when we go downstairs, you'll be able to see some of their clever work in masonry support, which we've partnered with them to develop and bring to the market. So, with that, I'd like to hand you over to our first speaker, Stewart Murray, Assistant Director of Planning for the Greater London Authorities. He has the unenviable task of drawing together the Greater London Plan as that emerges, and that's what he's going to be talking to us about this evening. To Stewart.
Thank you, John, for that sort of historic insight. I'm sure I'm not wearing my tunics and furs and wigs for the occasion. Yeah, maybe they should bring that back for mayors of London. I know some mayors, actually, of boroughs that do go down that route. So, anyway, thank you for that introduction. And it's a delight and honour to be here with a renowned audience of architects. I always say, being a chartered town planner, I'm throwing myself into the lion's den with architects, but we'll have a good debate, and it's all friends because we're all trying to deliver the same thing, which is development and quality, I hope. So I've been with the Greater London Authority for over 4 years. This is my second time round, so I've now got the acclaim of working with all three mayors of London. So I was with Ken at the beginning, joined Boris in his second term, and now with Sadiq in his early first term. And it's been a great journey, and all of them have their different sort of emphasis and shift of how they see London growing, developing, and how they see it in its place in terms of design and a place of quality to live. But they've all got these huge challenges, which is what they've tasked me with doing in terms of having a great, dynamic and deliverable development plan, as John described. And that's no easy task because we have to satisfy so many stakeholders in London, including architects, including communities, including boroughs, developers, and everybody who's got an interest in how London grows and develops. And by God are we growing, despite all the jitters and the cautiousness around Brexit and other things. So I'm going to take you through what the Mayor's first 5 months has come up with in terms of his emphasis, his priorities, and how he's charged us with taking forward very quickly his London Plan review. And he's got some decisions out already, so he's been very clear that London's open for business following the referendum vote on the EU. He's gone out and seen ambassadors and presidents and mayors of other cities around Europe and America, and keen to make sure that London is the premier location for inward investment, as it always has been. And he's also made some quick decisions of things around like air quality, trying to reduce the pollutants, and highlighted that we can't go on growing and having a dirty air, dirty city. So some really quick decisions about introducing air quality emission zones and further targets to get that cleaned up as soon as possible. And he's also made some decisions around development. I'm very pleased to say that we've got the planning machine, the strategic Greater London Authority planning decision machine up and running. And he says to me personally, I really enjoy the planning meetings. I really enjoy looking at new design, new development, and seeing where housing and new commercial development are being delivered. And we're taking this great city forward together with the development industry, with the architects, with the designers and the planners. And we've got to do more, and we've got to do it faster. So it's great to have a mayor that's completely engaged. So just let me go through where we're taking that in terms of his team, his priorities, and then his strategies. And some of these strategies are coming out in the next few weeks. So firstly, the new mayor and the mayor's team, I was just talking to some colleagues here tonight how there's been quite a changeover from the previous mayor. So I worked with Mayor Boris Johnson, and we had a very clear agenda there. We had a deputy mayor for planning, Sir Edward Lister, who's now gone to do greater things, as well as Boris, as we all see on TV every night mostly. We had Rick Blakeway was the Deputy Mayor for Housing, and we had a lot of mayors that were championing the design quality agenda. And it was all about growth and business development and making sure that London maintained and continued to excel in its preeminent financial and economic position. This mayor wants to continue that in most respects, but wants to address the housing crisis. So his manifesto commitment was very clear. That's his big top issue. He wants to use the planning system as well as a deal for housing for London to make sure he can deliver that. Certainly some quick wins in the first 4 years. So how are we going to do that? Well, the London plan's part of that. Devolution, I was just talking in the early reception, the mayor and our team have been over with government over here in Whitehall, trying to get a devolution deal for city government. So currently London only gets about 7% of the revenue that it generates compared to somewhere like New York and Paris, which have either less or just over half. And we want to give more freedom for the mayor to help the city grow and invest. So there's a big deal going on at the moment, trying to negotiate with the government, which are obviously got other things on their mind as well, like Brexit. And also about taking development forward. We've got some huge challenges to accelerate development and build more homes in particular, twice as many homes as we've traditionally built. And that raises these big issues about how and where and what is this going to look like and feel, and what sort of place. And that brings in the issues around density, tall buildings, strategic views, heritage, quality of place, public realm, all those things which keep architects and planners really stimulated and challenged. And the development agenda is the big key of how we're going to make that happen and make sure this is a pro-development, pro-growth, pro-business mayor. And there's a few things that are coming very shortly. So this is the mayor's team. I was going to do a quiz, can you name all of them? But you'll probably get me on the spot because I might not be able to name all of them. Some have only just started yesterday. We have, and I've missed that person out because she only just came in, I haven't got a photo, just Shirley Rodriguez. But the ones that we've ringed, which is, of course, the mayor, which I've mentioned, Sadiq Khan. But this is the Deputy Mayor, Jules Pipe, who I report to for planning regeneration skills. He also has the portfolio for the design agenda, so he's very much likely to head up a reconstituted mayoral design advisory group that ran under the previous mayor, but we repackaged. So we're going to be probably asking some of the architectural profession to join onto that advisory group to review the mayor's projects, TfL projects, public realm projects, big infrastructure projects, and the approach towards design. This person is James Murray, who was in early with the mayor in his first 100 days, and he's made his mark already. I should say Jules was the former mayor of Hackney, and James Murray was the former cabinet member for housing regeneration at London Borough of Islington, and he's the deputy mayor for housing and residential development. So we're doing a bit of a double act on the residential front. And James at the moment is negotiating very hard for a big London housing deal with government, particularly on affordable housing, which I'll touch upon, where the mayor is really clear that he wants to increase not only the total quantum of housing supply and delivery, but the contribution towards affordable housing and quality housing across the piece. And of course we deal with a lot of the other advisors. So we have Rajesh Godawi, which is the business advisor, Val Shawcross, who's the transport deputy mayor, and we have Justin Simons, who's the deputy mayor for culture, and so on and so on. I won't go through them all, but we're talking to all of them about making sure that we can deliver the mayor's manifesto commitments. And they're quite stark in terms of the development agenda. The first big one is, as you probably remember from, it seems a long time ago, the May elections for the mayor. It was all about housing. It really came up the agenda, whether we're getting enough affordable housing and solving the housing crisis. The mayor was very clear he wants to sort this out and get a deal with government. Currently, we've got a population of 8.7 million. We've surpassed our peak from 1939, but we haven't grown by 1 square metre. So we've got the same space geographically, but we've now got a bigger population, and it's growing rapidly by 70 to 100,000 a year. So we're basically every 3 or 4 years we get an extra London borough. And we've got to house them inside the metropolitan boundaries. So our record of delivering housing has not been great under 16 years of mayoralty and government. We are projected to go towards 10 to 11 million population by the 2030s and 40s, which is a mega city, by far the largest city in Europe, in Western Europe. And we're not proposing, this mayor has made a commitment not to encroach onto the Greenbelt. When we expanded at that rate last time in the 30s, we were going well into the countryside. There was no Greenbelt. So that presents challenges of how we're going to densify the city and how that's going to look and feel, and how we ensure London retains its quality, character, and its distinctiveness. But the mayor's sort of set out that he wants to get at least 50,000 new homes a year. We've only been building about half of that. We think the last year we probably got it to about 30,000, which was a really good year. But average is about 25. So how the hell do we get to double that and ramp up house building, particularly with the traditional house building model? There is a graph which shows that over about 70 years, the private sector house building delivery in London hasn't changed. It only has a few little blips with booms and busts, but actually the only glory years were in the 30s when there was no planning rules or Greenbelt, and in the 60s and 70s when there was massive council house building. But if you look at the private sector house building, it hasn't really changed very much. So we have to think of different models of delivery. And the mayor's been very committed to making sure that when we do double that housing supply, that we get many more affordable homes. And this has been the real problem about many Londoners, ordinary Londoners, particularly working Londoners, forced out of the city, which is exacerbating commuting. It's pushing people out beyond the boundaries. It's putting strain on the transport system. It's making businesses difficult to function. A lot of the business community now saying that their core workforce, even some of the more high-end and some of the educational institutions, such as the Crick Institute, said it's having a problem keeping its graduates in town because it can't afford to house them. So this is becoming a real problem that we haven't heard before. And so the mayor wants to approach this, not like the first mayor of London, which is all development must have 50% affordable, but how do we work together collaboratively to get towards more affordable housing across the piece? And it's all sorts of tenures: rented, private rented, social rent, shared ownership, discounted market, London living rent, all those sorts of products which can target ordinary Londoners across the piece. And then the big new challenge, which the mayor was hoping he wouldn't have to chase, is the economy in terms of Brexit. And he's launched with his new business deputy mayor, London's Open for Business, and he's very keen to protect the city, the financial business space, which drives much of our wealth, and the wider London economy, particularly the creative industries, the new sectors, the tech, the life science. These are the growing sectors which provide the jobs, and they also add to the cultural diversity. But it's very important to protect and promote those cultural offers of small and medium-sized industries, which, when you move away from the city, anyone who goes to Old Street or Deptford now, even Croydon, a lot of those small creative industries are driving the agenda. They're our new wealth creators, and they're becoming global players in some cases. It's no accident that Apple actually chose Battersea Power Station for their new London headquarters to put 6,000 jobs there. 10 years ago, Battersea Power Station was literally a derelict eyesore. It's still undergoing change, but we have turned things around quite rapidly. And then the environment, the mayor definitely wants to fix air quality and set some stringent targets, but not to overly impact on development viability. But he wants to clean up the air and to make sure that we get carbon neutral development. And the big ones, which is the row with government, or I should say the negotiation with government, is getting both investment for housing and infrastructure. So there's a big push by TfL to get funding for Crossrail 2. It's a £30 billion project from North East London to South West London and beyond the boundaries, which would unlock 200,000 new homes and 200,000 30,000 new jobs. So we're working very closely with TfL on delivering that and unlocking that through the London Plan. And then other extensions to existing tube lines like Bakerloo Line extension, you probably know about the Northern Line extension to Nine Elms Battersea. For the Bakerloo Line, we've identified the opportunity for 20 or 30,000 new homes along that corridor in South East London. So that'd be like the Elephant Castle down to Lewisham, potentially beyond. And a big push for public sector sites release, particularly TfL, which is under the Mayor's direct control, to identify that for growth and housing. So that presents that design challenge as well. And the big government fiscal devolution asks. The Mayor wants to hold more of the taxes, such as stamp duty or local property taxes. Dare I say, a better deal comparative to what Scotland's getting, even maybe income tax element or sales taxes. And he wants to very much focus on fairness of a more socially integrated and inclusive city for all Londoners. And he has appointed Matthew Ryder as his Deputy Mayor for pursuing that objective alongside all the other strategies. And in terms of the planning priorities, how we translate all that into planning and development, you think, well, a lot of that's all very well, but what does it mean for development? The Mayor often sees that the London Plan is at the linchpin, the heart of his strategies, alongside housing strategy, transport strategy, cultural strategy, environment strategy, etc. We've been working really rapidly over the summer to translate the Mayor's manifesto commitments into a direction of travel document called the Towards the London Plan and these other strategies. And that will come out, we're hoping, giving you a bit of insight here, maybe the end of this month or early November. There'll be a big launch at City Hall, and there'll be some round table sessions where we'll be inviting people to comment on the new strategies coming forward to turn those into policies and give them statutory weight in due course. And that will be, the London Plan will be leading the charge on that at the end of this month. So watch this space. Been keeping me busy. And we've got the research underway. We're working with the whole sector, including the development, property sector, the design sector, boroughs and the transport and infrastructure agencies to see what London needs. We're hoping to produce a draft London Plan in a year. That's a bit of a record. We hope to have an examination in public in the following year and get it published before 19 because the Mayor's up for election in 2020. And in that, the Mayor wants to move towards a 50% affordable housing target, but that's London-wide. So he's starting with an initial go in the next few weeks around what we call a housing supplementary planning guidance document, which will have a 35% benchmark value towards viability. And he's asking for these new planning powers for devolution, and dare I say, even maybe a mayoral permitted development order. So there's quite a lot of package of things coming our way which will affect the development and the way we deliver these priorities. He definitely has said he wants a different type of plan to the ones we produced before. We produced about 3 or 4 London plans over different mayors. He wants this one to be slimmer, more radical, directive, focused on delivery, and I should have added, he wants to make sure that quality is not compromised, that we get quality in the London Plan. And how is that going to be done? Well, the growth agenda is presenting all those challenges. We need to get higher densities and we need to design those so we have quality places. He's very much focused around transport hubs and town centres. Doesn't want to build on open spaces in the green belts, so we're not getting any more land. We've got to be more creative. We need your sector to help us do that. We've got 38 brownfield opportunity areas. We want to move to 42 and more. So the new London Plan, we need to have your input into where they could be. We want to really push these growth-led transport corridors such as Crossrail 2, river crossings, which there was a bit of an announcement today. Metroisation, which is a strange term where we're hoping the Mayor gets fiscal devolution over some of the rail franchises, particularly south of the river, where we can then apply this approach of growth-led corridors to much of South London, because a lot of it's been north of the river or east. And we've launched some spatial approaches to growth called City in the East east and city in the west, with new London architecture promotions and other events, and we're pushing that forward into the London plan and turning it into reality. And we're looking at some really challenging issues like suburban intensification, talking to our southeast neighbours who are up for growth along transport corridors in particular, and we're looking at some challenging issues around land use designation, particularly industry and spaces that might be out beyond their normal function. And that's our traditional sort of spatial plan that's in the existing London plan under the Boris regime. And you can see these various growth corridors, and you can see where we focused very much in the east of London, around Olympic Park and going east, and in central London. But other parts of London have been fairly quiet, such as in the southwest, maybe because they're not as well connected. We talk about Western Wedge, but what does that mean? Well, we're all waiting for a decision on Heathrow and airports, a bit controversial. And we've always had this aspiration for trying to develop this London Stansted Cambridge-Peterborough corridor, and we're working with Network Rail on that and those authorities. But we need to actually turn this from an aspirational development plan into a delivery plan. So, moving into that realm, we have the opportunity areas. Now, these will deliver most of the growth over the coming 25 years, about 300,000 plus homes, about 575,000 new jobs. And you probably know about one big one here at Old Oak Common, which is a new mayoral development corporation. That's about 26,000 homes and thousands of new jobs along the Crossrail 1 and High Speed 2 link. But we've got to try and make sure we can deliver all of these just to get anywhere near that massive housing target, particularly places like the Upper Lee Valley and East London and the Thames Gateway. So we launched this various documents to try and put that into practice rather than just aspirational. So we had earlier in this year City in the East, and we looked at how the East London opportunity areas have taken longer to deliver, and now we want to accelerate that, and how it relates to the wider area. We think we can get 200,000 new homes. Here's the big reservoir brownfield land, 250,000 jobs, 600,000 more Londoners. So that's where we're now working with those East London boroughs like Barking, Dagenham, Havering and Bexley to really unlock those places. And using transport as the catalyst, including river crossings, London Overground extension to Barking Riverside, which you've been hearing a lot about, and then Crossrail coming down through Greenwich, Woolwich and to Abbey Wood in Bexley, and maybe extending that down to Ebbsfleet, where there's a Paramount and a development corporation there. And the big one, the Upper Lee Valley, you start to see now the Crossrail 2 potential, and how we can really start to unlock development potential. And when we started looking at East London, we were looking at 52,000 homes and 200,000 jobs, and now 11, 12 years on we're looking at over 200,000 homes and 300,000 jobs. So it shows you, if you put your mind to it, you can really start to push the densities, and you can see how this part of London starts to become much more part of a connected city. And this is the challenge for the design and development community, how to make this work as a living place, a living city, rather than vast brownfield industrial sites and neglected utility areas and fragmented neighbourhoods. And we're working on moving industries and moving land uses so we can actually make sure that London can function both economically and in housing terms. Now, moving west, we launched City in the West a bit later under this mayoralty, and we're focused very much on the quiet growth areas such as southwest London and areas where Crossrail 1's coming forward in 2 or 3 years' time, but actually there hasn't really been a growth catalyst behind it. So they've been overlooked, like in Hayes and Harlington. Ealing's already kicking off, but there are places like Southall about to come forward, and how we extend that Crossrail 2 from the Upper Lee Valley northeast through the central London down to places like Kingston. Who would believe that Kingston would have 10 new Crossrail stations and plan as a growth borough? It's been a quiet borough for the last 15 years, and so we started to focus on these areas and how they could become connected up. And we think that we can probably deliver tens of thousands of new jobs in areas where they haven't been looked at before. But we've got to make sure that places like Kingston, which are historic boroughs, we do that correctly with people like yourself and the borough and the communities to make quality places. And this presents the how. Well, London's got to get denser. Some people have got an issue about tall buildings, and we've got a London Plan chapter on this, and strategic viewing corridors, and we're trying to work with the boroughs and the development industry and the architectural profession to make sure that only tall buildings of the highest quality are in the right locations. And so how we define that and where they go. We know about the City of London. You get the tallest buildings in Canary Wharf. There's an interesting place that I'm going to visit tomorrow at South Quay, where there's transformation of densities and tall buildings compared to places like Hong Kong. But you don't want that all over London. That's not London. And we need to think about other densities, mid-rise densities in places that are intensifying. But we've got to get more into lesser space. And we've got tall buildings policies. This is where we are at the moment. This is just a bit of a sort of discourse around, well, does the London Plan say the right thing about tall buildings? We talk about all these things. We've got high standards, design, public realm, energy efficiency, sustainability, impact on neighbouring areas, blah, blah, blah. And then we talk about how it generates regeneration. Economic activities should be located in activity zones such as the central area, opportunity area, town centres and good public transport. Is that really happening? And should the new London Plan be more directive around that? And then we get the issues often from the boroughs about, well, what about the character of the area? These tall buildings are going out to the suburbs now on transport nodes like the Outer London Crossrail stations. And in historic England often raise the issues about the impact on heritage and the historic environment and the World Heritage sites, and often open space. So this is a bit of a battleground, and we're trying to make sure that the London Plan takes that balancing act, that there's appropriate locations for tall buildings of the highest quality with environmental assessments, and there are places where they're not appropriate, and we work together to work those out. It's not a free-for-all. And you can see where in the central area, the CAS, the City of London is always promoted in the Eastern Cluster tall buildings, and there's more coming. We've got the 38 opportunity areas with those new homes, so there's going to have to be intensification and some areas for tall buildings and higher densities most definitely. And we've got the town centres, and there's a bit of regeneration here and how we can recreate and retrofit and regenerate some of those town centres in a qualitative way. And I think we've got some really good examples like Ealing and Harrow and dare I say even Croydon, which is sort of reinventing itself right now. And we've got to exploit transport, because if we're asking government for billions of pounds to invest in new transport and tunnels under London, then we've got to make sure that growth can help pay for part of that, whether that's community infrastructure levy or taxes like on the Northern Line extension with tariffs. So where they're the most accessible, we will expect higher density. And there's the strategic viewing corridors, highly sensitive with people like local communities, the heritage lobby, Historic England, but we've got to be sensible about this. How much of this is what we want to protect of London's distinct character, and how much of it is fit for purpose, or is it holding back development and economic development? And that will be part of the review. I'm sure places like Palace of Westminster, St Paul's and Tower London will be protected, but there are some backdrop views where you need basically telescopic eyes to see the view of an historic World Heritage site, which we protect, and it has a cone or a corridor, and it restricts quite significant amounts of development. So is that correct, or do we need to revisit that and rebalance that? And one of the areas I'm working on at Euston Station is going to be a very interesting discussion, how we design a new station with overstation development along 2 or 3 viewing corridors that all clash in the centre. And we need to make sure that we have a London View management framework which sits underneath the London Plan, which works and it's practical and it can be interpreted, and we get quality development that protects London historic features. And we make sure that those protected views, it's not just the long views but also the local views, ensure that London's distinctiveness and its character will not turn into another Singapore or Hong Kong. So we're looking at the layers of where this would happen, and this is not necessarily where all high densities would go, but it's certainly where tall buildings would be located. And we look at what's been approved. There's a bit of a Skyline campaign been a bit more interrogation around this at the moment, and the Mayor's Design Advisory Group will look at that. And you can see where tall buildings from, say, 10 to 14, which is a tall building in some outer suburbs, and you get up to 70 plus in places like the City and Canary Wharf. People think there's too many tall buildings, but actually we're talking about 200 or 300. And there's actually a difference between what's approved and what actually gets built. You only have to look at the City of London and the Pinnacle building, which is only now just maybe coming up. And there are areas which are really challenging, like Euston, where we need to not only get the design of those places and the infrastructure, like the station right and high speed too, but we need to think about how that place is going to work and pay for a lot of that infrastructure with these viewing corridors that cross over and restrict what can happen. So a lot of that 1960s Euston station is impeded by previous planning constraints. And one wouldn't say, unless you are a 60s brutalist fan, that is a beautiful place or a beautiful gateway into London. So what can we do to make it better? So we're trying to use technology. Peter Murray at NLA is always trying to make me introduce the three-dimensional plan for the entire London capital city for all development. So we are working on that to make better informed decisions about impacts and design, intensification, delivering the Mayor's objectives. And we're looking very much at how that starts to become clusters of where intensification, tall buildings will happen, such as the central area. And we're working with other people like Department of Transport, High Speed 2, in places like Euston, to make sure all these things come together and that we get it right. So we deliver homes, we deliver jobs, we improve the infrastructure, we create great quality places, great pieces of city, and it's a lasting legacy which ensures that London remains on the map as a great place to work, live and play. So, what's coming next? Well, watch this space. Hope you enjoyed that. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Stuart. I should have said before we started there will be option for question and answer at the end of the two speakers, so use the pens and pads provided to make yourselves a note. I'm sure there's plenty that came up through that presentation, and thanks for that. So now going to move on to Allan Wilén from Glenigan, the Chief Economist. I'm sure we've all got questions around what's happening in the sector as a whole. What effect is Brexit having? What effect will it have? I'm sure he has all the answers. But yes, over to Allan. And actually, I should have also said we are live tweeting the event. So if you are on Twitter, there's a hashtag London Development, which there's a steady stream of information going out on. So feel free to retweet along. Thank you, Allan.
Thank you, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, I'm Allan Wilén, the Economics Director at Glenigan. What I was going to do really for the next sort of 20-25 minutes is really run through how Glenigan sees the market going now. We produced our last forecast at the beginning of July, which was interesting because obviously we were working on it prior to the vote, so there was a bit of reassessing that had to go on following the Brexit vote. But we're still in a bit of a period of a lack of data at the moment, which is interesting. So everyone's trying to sort of read the grains and the runes on each piece of information that's come out. At Glenigan, we're quite fortunate in the sense that some of the data we've got here. We hold at Glenigan. Actually, effectively, if I just move on. It's basically we track every single construction project that's been planned in the UK. We pick up things at planning, prior to planning, and we'll track those projects, anything over $250,000 through the process, through start on site to completion. Now obviously that's a valuable resource for our customers in terms of finding out opportunities and specific sort of leads. But from my perspective, it's really valuable because it gives us a fantastic data set of information. Effectively allows us to drill down and in a very granular level to look at different sectors, different regions, to really try and see what's potentially coming down through the pipeline over the next couple of years. And that's the information I'm going to be drawing on really in our assessment now in the next sort of 20 minutes. And as I go through that, really to try and say, okay, where are the opportunities going to be over the next couple of years, where the challenge is going to be. But I think perhaps as a starting point, it makes sense to look at the wider economic picture. Clearly that has changed quite a bit over the last few months, or potentially has. Prior to the Brexit vote, we were looking at very much at a private sector-led recovery, being driven very much by consumer spending on the one hand, which was starting to come back. We had rising employment. There's an upturn underway in the housing market, which was supporting more house building activity, but also fundamentally strong business investment. And that had been a major driver over the last few years, really, particularly in the commercial and industrial fields for construction, but for the wider economy too. Now, post-Brexit, and in fact even actually in the run-up to the vote, we saw that business investment in particular being held up, being delayed, people were prevaricating. And I think following the vote, we're now entering perhaps a period of protracted prevarication, as developers and investors really reappraise what that Brexit means for them, for their business, for their project. I was just speaking to some people earlier on and saying there's a lot of rescoping that's been going on over the last few months for different projects. Doesn't mean those projects are not necessarily going to go ahead, but people really are trying to sort of look and see where they're likely to go over the next couple of years and how they fit into an emerging picture. And given that the politicians are still working on what that emerging picture is going to be, we are in, as I say, a period of protracted uncertainty. And certainly that has clearly hit business investment and is continuing to do so. Now, from an industry point of view, from a UK manufacturing perspective, that's got implications for industrial buildings, for example. Short-term benefit at the moment the manufacturers are seeing in terms of the weaker sterling, helping their export opportunities. But actually in the long term, there's the whole issue of the threat to single and access to the single market and that market overall. So against that background, is that an encouragement for them to actually press ahead with investment plans in new capacity? And that's not just on the manufacturing side. I think we're seeing that in some of the services side potentially as well. And against that background, we're probably looking at potentially a weaker consumer spending going forward if we are looking at weaker economic growth. And as a result of that, obviously, renewed pressure on the government finances. And we've already seen there, actually, the government responding to that. We've seen them saying, actually, our objective of balancing the books by 2020 is out the window. We're going to relax the policy. And certainly over the last week, we've seen perhaps a little bit more detail emerging about how they want to put more money, particularly into construction. And I think that's a particularly encouraging thing, because if you look at the long-term trend for how construction has performed against the wider economy, the somewhat erratic red line is construction. And it's still erratic, but perhaps a little bit more stable. Green bars is the wider economy GDP growth. And I think I put a black line up there because I think it's a useful indicator, because it shows you that actually, as a prerequisite to seeing growth in construction output, you need a 2% rise in the wider economy. Now, if you look at the forecast figures on the far right there, which is what the OBR were forecasting prior to the Brexit vote, we were just above that 2% threshold. So that boded well. But we are probably looking at below 2% now over the next year or so. So that doesn't bode so well for construction output. And certainly if you look at some of the ONS figures, there's lots of revisions going on. But even prior to the Brexit vote, we probably did slip into at least a technical recession. For want of a better word, in the first half of this year, and I think the second half is clearly going to be fragile. I think we've got GDP figures coming out shortly, so I think everyone will be looking at those quite closely to see what's happened for the first time in the third quarter of this year. Having said that, There's one exception to that 2% rule, and that was in 2010, where you can see we've got a sharp spike in construction output, following obviously a very sharp fall in the previous year. But GDP actually fell quite sharply that year, very, very sharply indeed. And that's because in response to the credit crunch, the then Labour government pushed forward a lot of investments and expenditure and tried to drag forward, pull forward public sector spending into the construction area. And maybe we're going to be seeing more of that coming forward. Maybe we're going to see that counterbalance coming forward. Certainly some of the rhetoric we saw from the new Chancellor seems to support that. So actually, that could be a useful balancing opportunity. Now, what it does mean for construction is that perhaps some of the growth areas that people have been working in over the last few years won't necessarily be the growth areas over the next couple of years at least. This was the initial financial markets reaction to the Brexit vote. Obviously the pound fell against the euro strengthened, and the FTSE 250 in particular fell, whereas the wider FTSE 100, which is much more international companies, fared much better, recovered much better. But I think it's interesting the verdict on perhaps the industry's key clients that was not so favourable. Both the developers and house builders were marked down particularly sharply and fiercely by the city, really because there was a feeling that actually the climate had changed post-Brexit. Okay, so what does that mean for particular key markets going forward? Well, if we look at starting with the wider consumer side of things, we have seen sort of low inflation, as I was saying earlier on, and an increased employment coming forward, and wage growth, and also rising household spending as a result of that. But going forward, I think we've got a more uncertain outlook. I think in the near term, there could be something of a dampening of confidence. But as we get into next year, potentially we're looking at perhaps weaker employment growth as a result of that lack of investment that's going on, that nervousness generally. Recruitment's not happening in the same way as it has been previously. But also we're importing inflation at the moment. We've seen those sharp falls in the pound that's benefiting UK exporters, but it's also increasing costs. We'll start to see that come forward as higher prices in the high street, I think, over the coming years. So that's going to squeeze household budgets, and potentially the banks may get a little bit nervous as well and start to rein in. So that doesn't necessarily bode too well for the wider housing market, not just new house building. We've been seeing a modest recovery over the last couple of years in property transactions, and that's been supported by, or been followed by, accompanied by a rise in house price inflation as well. But if you look at the first half of this year, there has been something of a loss of momentum already. Now, there's been a number of factors. It's not all Brexit by any means. There's been a number of factors at play there. Not only that we've seen quite a sharp recovery, house prices have been running ahead of earnings growth prior to this year. So the affordability has been suffering. But we've also seen some stamp duty changes. And if you look at the first few months of this year, March, there was an incredible amount of property transactions. There's a lot of a lot of the buy-to-let people and second home purchases were all pushed through prior to a sharp increase in stamp duty rates for them, and then it fell away quite sharply in April. But it's not really recovered either after that, and I think it was already on a slightly cooling trend as well. So if you look at actually property transactions in August, they were 6% down on where we were a year ago, and the latest lending data in terms of mortgage approvals, which is a sort of leading indicator of where transactions will be in a few months down time, they're down 21% on where we were a year ago. So the banks clearly aren't lending, so either they're not having so many inquiries or they're not lending so readily as they were prior to that. So in addition to that, obviously we've seen something of a cooling in the prime residential market, which obviously got implications for London in particular. So let's get, as I say, a slightly weaker and less encouraging outlook as we go into the second half of this year and into 2017. Certainly on the demand side of things. But actually the supply side is strong still. We track and we publish with the Home Builders Federation data in terms of mortgage planning approvals, and there's a strong supply pipeline there still. So house builders have had the confidence confidence. And there's been a number of factors for that, not just the fact that demand has been strong over the last few years, but we've seen a number of planning reforms coming forward. The NPPF a few years ago does seem to have improved the success rate of schemes across England. We did a little bit of analysis looking at the success rate of applications prior and after the NPPF came on. And I think it was interesting. Large schemes can be relatively small. They're schemes of 10 or more, and small schemes are obviously below that. And it's interesting that the success rate of both of those improved over that period in terms of we weren't withdrawn or turned down. But interestingly, that it's the small schemes that are still less successful than the large schemes, which I think is intriguing and does seem slightly counterintuitive at first glance. But I think it shows the amount of work that designers, architects, and all the other professions have to do prior to get a scheme ready to go through the planning process, and the amount of work that's involved. And obviously that's not necessarily so easy to do cost effectively on a smaller scheme. And intriguingly, if you look at it on a regional picture, seeing that London, having initially led the recovery in the market, has perhaps lost some momentum over the last year in terms of planning applications, both in terms of units and in terms of the value of projects securing approval. The 26 figures are up to August, which is why the overall bar in terms of value of work is lower. But you still get a flavour for how the pattern had perhaps been shifting away from the capital over the last year in 2015 and going into 2016 as well. But it has been growing for a lot stronger for longer, and I think that kind of sums up the challenge I think that the Mayor is going to be facing over the next couple of years. So we've already been growing quite strongly, we're at a strong place, but obviously the targets and the need and the demand is clearly still much higher than that over the longer term. So where do we see the private housing side of things going over that period? Well, intriguingly, despite all that bad news, it does sound bad, what we're looking at is slower growth at the moment. We're still projecting that we will see continued growth in the UK despite all those uncertainties, but it will dampen and it'll take the lustre off perhaps some of the stronger growth we've seen over the last few years. So we're looking nationally at a picture of still 12% this year, and then it's slowing down to around 9% growth in terms of the value of projects starting on site next year. So there's still plenty of opportunities out there, but I think there's still a lot of uncertainty and nervousness, I think, that's going to be increasingly hanging over the market, both in the capital, particularly in hotspot areas like the prime residential market, but across the country as well. Turning away from the residential side to retail, really just to give a picture of the national picture there, because I think this is an interesting one, because again, very much dependent on consumer confidence, perhaps over the longer term, and that has been returning, so you would think that would be boding well for retailers, encouraging more investment. But at the same time, there's a lot of structural change going on there, and there's clearly a supermarket price war in full swing at the moment, but clearly, in addition to that, online sales are increasingly taking market share away from the bricks and mortar purchases. Interesting, if you look back over the last few years, given the rate of growth in retail sales via online purchases, it pretty well sucks up all of the volume growth in retail sales over that period. So there's not really been any sort of dynamic growth in the high street and in shopping centres. Now those retailers are responding to that, offering click and collect, for example, and it's offering up opportunities for development as well as a result of that, both in terms of remodelling and repurposing existing stores to accommodate the sort of click and collect type market, but also in terms of the larger shopping centres, in terms of remodelling those and extending those. I mean, the classic example of that is the Westfield development in West London, which I thought was pretty big already, but now they're building a huge extension to it, and they're putting a lot more leisure into it, so they can get much more dwell time. So they're putting in cinemas and things like that, so people see it as a destination. You can't go to the cinema online in the same way. It's not quite the same experience. And certainly eating out in a restaurant is not the same online. So you've got to have to do something to get a bit more dwell time there, and that's the secret that they're pursuing. And see, there's a general strategy there. So I think that's going to offer up a lot of opportunities over the longer term as people adjust to that structural change in the market. So as a result of that, yes, whilst we're seeing projecting a fall in project starts this year, underlying project starts, we're still looking at a growth going into next year, despite of all that potential uncertainty out there. Now, turning to hotel and leisure, this is potentially an early beneficiary from the Brexit vote. We've got the weaker sterling. Interestingly, a lot of the online sort of monitoring, comparison sites and that sort of thing, and Google and what have you, they were reporting just after the Brexit vote and obviously the fall in the pound, a lot more inquiries of people doing searches globally about travel to the UK. So suddenly we've become a much more attractive holiday destination. So that potentially really is a useful longer-term boost for this sector, and may encourage more investment and help. As you can see, there's quite a development pipeline that architects and designers have been working on for some time that could be brought forward and come on site. We could well see some more schemes coming forward as well. In addition to that, obviously, the weaker pound makes it more expensive for us to travel abroad. So staycations, holidaying in the UK, again, will help support this sector going forward. So actually, I think this is quite a positive one. So whilst we've got a drop in project starts during the current year, something a rebound, looking at 13% growth in the sector in terms of project starts as we get into 2017. And that's at the national level, but clearly one of the key destinations is the capital for overseas visitors. So you can see a lot of that investment coming forward into London over the next couple of years. Now, the area that I am particularly concerned about in terms of growth prospects is the office market. We're talking about the developers repurposing their plan. It has been a growth area for some time. Clearly the demand has potentially been there and remains there. The graph on the left is data from Knight Frank. And it's tracking basically floor space that's under construction at the moment in central London against total availability of vacant floor space that's already there to let. But I've reversed the scale on the red line there, and you can see that it's increasingly tight, and that's quite a useful lead indicator, as you can see from here, of a turnaround. You can see how the peaks and troughs, it's a turnaround and lead indicator of where the underlying market's going to be going. So clearly, potentially a lot of demand there. But post-Brexit, I think there is going to be a lot of reappraising going. And I think it's that whole problem, as I say, it's trying to, as you can see the mayor at the moment, as Stewart was saying, is trying to show that the UK, London is open for business. Because I think particularly the financial sector does seem to be vulnerable. I think there's the West End markets, and it's interesting that Apple has selected Battersea Power Station. I think that looks relatively firm and positive going forward, but it's the financial areas, I think, the London in terms of the city and Docklands that are potentially vulnerable for people actually holding back, thinking about, are we going to have to relocate some of our workforce out of the city to make sure it's within the EU? And I think that could well dampen growth, unfortunately, in the capital overall over the next few years, until we have a clearer picture starting to emerge. So the sooner that concerns can be reassured there, the better. And certainly there's a large pipeline of projects that can come forward. This is planning approvals up to 100 million. We can see that London does still dominate the market, but there has been a shift over the last few years away from the capital in terms of there's been stronger growth in other major centres, Birmingham and Manchester, in part because actually there's been very little investment in those areas over the last few years. So actually that, coming back to that graph in terms of central London, in terms of availability, it's even worse outside of the capital. So that has actually stimulated some more investment in those areas as a result of that, and we've got particularly some overseas investment looking at those areas. But interesting, if you include all schemes, including the large schemes, which are predominantly in the capital, you can see that London still dominates even more in terms of the development pipeline going forward. But you can see that sharp drop-off in the first few months of this year. There has been quite a sharp fall in approvals. People are, and again, I think that's a reflection of people pausing and holding back from pressing ahead with schemes. Very quickly, just to touch on the industrial one, because I think that's an interesting one. It's the flip side of what we were talking about on the retail side of things. I think looking ahead in terms of industrial buildings, not necessarily something that's going to impact particularly on the capital, but whilst the manufacturing side of things has fallen back quite sharply, or quite a bit over the last year, and I think will remain weak going forward because of those points I was making earlier on about manufacturers' concern about access to exports and their markets going forward. The other thing that's fallen away and has been a real driver for the sector over the last few years has been investment in the logistics space. Now, a lot of that has been due to that growth of the internet and the changing in shopping habits that's been going on. And I think at the moment that initial fall is a temporary one. I think it's people nervousness trying to assess what's going to happen, and I think that will come back. There's plenty of projects in the pipeline, and I think that will be a growth area and return to a growth area over the next couple of years once confidence starts to come back and it's a clearer picture. Because it's really been driven by that structural change. Moving on to sort of perhaps the government sector side of things, because I think that's going to be an interesting area going forward. This is the planning approvals pipeline. You've seen there's been a strong growth up to this point in social housing approvals over the last few years. But if you look at the figures in terms of where the growth has been and is going to be, London has been suffering. In fact, if you look at those approval figures for the last 3 years, actually the value of approvals has been falling in the capital in terms of year-on-year growth quite sharply. And I think a lot of that is a reflection of government policy and the high cost of developing in the capital in terms of land costs and so forth. And given the pressure in terms of the new policies in terms of extending the right to buy, the cap on rents and that sort of thing, I think it's prompting a lot of social housing developers to really make sure, look where they get most bang for their buck. There's plenty of need for social housing across the UK, and I think there's a lot of development therefore has been moving out of the capital, unfortunately. So I think that's going to be one of the big challenges that the capital is going to be having to address, I think, over the next couple of years to try and encourage more of that investment to come back into London, where clearly there's a strong demand and need for that sort of accommodation. But I think overall the pattern is sort of one under pressure because of those government policy caps at the moment. We're looking at potentially a quite sharp fall in project starts over the next, this year and next. Really sort of very sharp fall, in fact, as we get into next year because of that lack of government policy in that area. Now, this is going to be an area that's interesting. You saw a lot of announcements yesterday at the party conference, Conservative Party conference, about how they want to help their housing market and drive investment. Very much perhaps directed at the private housing side, getting more house builders in there. But the social housing side of things is going to have to be addressed as well. And it may well be that this could be an area where the government policy does shift. There is a reflection of that. If they're looking at things that can be brought forward quickly, and the Chancellor does seem to be looking at that sort of counterbalance side, social housing was surely an area where a little bit more money can very quickly feed through to action on the ground. So whilst it looks very, negative at the moment in terms of government outlook. Actually, this could, particularly as you get towards the end of 2017, going into 2018, we could start to see a turnaround potentially if the government has the appetite to actually try and drive forward investment in this area, and to counterbalance perhaps weakness that could be emerging elsewhere in the economy and in the industry. But certainly on our current forecast, we're not positive for social housing provision, particularly in England, over the longer term. Quickly moving on to other areas like education, for example. Actually, this is potentially something the government's going to have to do. Its hand's being forced. There's just more kids, effectively. It takes them a long time to respond to that, but they are having to respond to it nevertheless. We've already seen quite a sharp upturn in primary school accommodation investment coming forward in that area over the last few years. And it's been very much in places like London and the other major metropolitan areas where the pressure has been greatest and the need to find more school places has been strongest. And that has been generating a lot of investment in extending primary schools, building new ones. Going forward, the demographics are shifting. The children are getting older, and now actually from this year, up to this year, nationally school numbers at secondary school were falling. Pupil rolls have started to rise from this year onwards and will continue to rise. So it's going to be increasing pressure. A lot of secondary schools are already under capacity anyway, so there's going to be a lot more investment coming forward in those areas, and the government's going to have to respond to that. Again, this is an area, if they can overcome some of the policy obstacles, because there's a lot of other things they're trying to deliver on education, it could be an area where they actually could start to see investment come forward relatively quickly. I think at the moment we've got a bit of a weak picture, certainly for this year, and there's a lot of prevarication going on there. There's all the policy about free schools and things like that, and perhaps potentially grammar schools. All of those things potentially could delay things, but if they can free up the resources, and perhaps there's more devolution that's required to local authorities to actually give them a bit more power to actually drive forward and tackle that lack of capacity in school places within their local authority much more effectively. And quickly then, finally, health is another area where actually we can see some growth coming forward over the next couple of years, but that is really a recovery from a very sharp fall that we saw in the value of projects starting on site last year. I think what happened is in the run-up to the election last year, a lot of projects were put on hold and deferred prior to the election because of the purdah period, and then after that there was a general review going on. If you look at the development pipeline, it's not expanding particularly, but I think 2015 was a bit of an aberration, a bit of a pause. So we're looking at further return to growth from that low base in 2015 going forward. But not very many big, major, high-profile hospitals in the pipeline at the moment. So it's much smaller scale projects. Again, potentially if it's smaller scale projects, it's something the government could perhaps help to drive. But I think given the pressures on the NHS, that the investment in capital in new building facilities isn't going to be necessarily top of the NHS priority at present. And just finally, just to touch on the infrastructure side of things, I think if it picks up on some of the points that Stewart was making earlier on, I think it's interesting. We've seen again a shift in government policy away from renewables over the last few years, and that's caused a bit of a hiatus. But actually, there's also been constrained by other things, such as pressure on Network Rail's budgets as well. They've had to really look at repurposing things. But longer term, we can see more investment coming forward in that area. Some obviously big high-profile projects coming forward. Potentially with new facilities, new buildings to support them. We've already mentioned the Northern Line extension and other projects further out, but also even more high-profile projects as HS2 extensions to Heathrow, Gatwick, which we shall see. At the same time, obviously things like Crossrail, they're now in the final phases there where they're building out the project, and it's actually sort of running down. So overall, we've had a bit of a dip over the last, in 2015, partial recovery this year and further strengthening in growth in 2017. So quickly to summarise the wider economic picture, the EU referendum has sort of prolonged the Brexit vote uncertainty, and I think that's going to for the next, for the foreseeable future, actually for the next couple of years. And against that background, I think we are going to be looking at slower UK economic growth during that period. The government had been looking to the private sector to lead the recovery. I think it's adjusting its policy, it's scaling back its fiscal ambitions in terms of balancing the budget. There does seem to be a willingness to perhaps counterbalance that, and in fairness, to target construction as a way of helping to drive and reshape the new economy, whatever shape that's going to be. As that emerges, there is the need for more investment in the infrastructure and the wider infrastructure, the built environment, to deliver long-term economic growth and to really sort of mark out the type of economy we're going to have going forward. So I think that does bode well. I think that's going to act as a counterpoint. They're going to obviously be looking to the private sector to partner with and drive forward that investment wherever possible. But we are looking perhaps at a rebalance. They talk about rebalancing the wider economy, the UK, the London versus the rest of the UK. Actually, I think there's going to be a rebalancing across the construction sectors as well over the next couple of years, with more growth coming forward perhaps in some of the public sector side than it has been in the past, and weaker in those key drivers like office construction that have been driving things over the last few years. So hopefully that gives you an overall view of where we're going. Regionally, so this year I think London is bearing the brunt in terms of the value of projects starting on site. Big retraction there, with a bit more stability as we get into 2017, whereas other parts of the country are expected to fare perhaps a little bit better over the medium term. That I shall leave it and open it up to any questions.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that, Alan. And as he says, we're now going to open the floor to questions, and Stuart's going to join Alan on the stage. So are there any hands shooting up straight away? There we go.
My name's Philip Berard, I'm an architect. I just want to know, I'd be interested to know if there have been any studies recently the effects of high-rise on families living in high-rise block. I know it was a big deal in the 60s, a lot of people criticised 60s high-rise being disastrous, and many of those blocks have been demolished. But now there seems to be an emphasis now that we're talking about high-rise for maybe lower income or middle income families. What I'm saying is, can it be justified from a psychological point of view for families to be living high above ground?
I think there have been quite a few surveys, and some quite recently. Don't ask me to quote them, but we've seen quite a lot of research. Some of them coming from a particular agenda, but certainly around the Skyline campaign, there is a whole raft of research about what people's desires and aspirations and the social impacts of high-rise living. And the mayor and the mayor's team are quite attuned to this. So the deputy mayor for planning and regeneration, came from London Borough of Hackney, and we were considering just yesterday in front of the mayor two very large 1960s housing estate regeneration projects with towers built in the 60s that were seen as the panacea for family housing and the quality housing in the sky, and deck housing, as we know, and those being pulled down now and creating still higher density, but having a much more sophisticated approach to what residents, families and tenants want in terms of children, play spaces, amenity spaces, social infrastructure, ensuring that families are given priority on the larger family units, particularly at the lower levels, so often the ground floor units or duplexes with gardens and private amenity space are given priority to those families. And what I think is really important is a big shift with the research. What the psychological effects are is that We don't put needy families all in one big tower block with the children at the top and isolated environments and poor management and communal and poor quality communal areas. And we've learnt the lessons. So we should know, both in terms of architecture, design, planning, social housing, and development and construction, and management in particular, how to do it properly. And I think what's coming forward, for example, these two Hackney housing estate schemes, was that we're mixing the tenures, we're coming up with creative design solutions with proper facilities, good management, distinctive places, public realm, private spaces, children's facilities which are part of the community, they're integrated into community. And we're now doing surveys along with the private house builders, like Berkeley Homes do surveys of their residents, such as Woodbury Down and Kidbrooke Estate in Greenwich, of what those rehoused social tenants and families, what their experience is now compared to what they were living in some pretty appalling mono-tenure 1960s tower blocks. So yes, there is a raft of information. I'd love to come back and report on that and how we're doing.
Okay, we'll have to take you up on that one. Okay, another question.
One of my fears, I'm sure shared by some of the people here, is the problem of retaining communities who rely on housing benefit. Can you talk a little bit about how those communities might be protected and kept in London, and perhaps also talk a little bit about rent caps and if there's any specific plans?
Go first.
Well, just on the rent cap side, I think that's an interesting one because they've got this cap below inflation now. And just looking at the detailed planning approval side of things, there was already a drift away in terms of planning applications for social housing in the capital against other parts of the country. So my concern is if you have got those rent caps, like on the one hand, purely, and I think those rent caps are there because obviously they've got concerns about the cost of housing benefit in particular is one of the factors there. That solves one problem. The other problem is effectively that you can't get the numbers to stack up. Yes, they're talking about release of land on that sort of public sector land to get the development. That would help to bring the cost of those sort of developments down perhaps a little bit more. Maybe there's more cost subsidy in terms of mixed tenure. You've got to do something to try and make sure perhaps they're affordable at the same time, but the figures have got to add up really to make those schemes fundable, and they're not at the moment.
Yeah, I think I would certainly recommend listening out to what's coming from both the Mayor of London and his Deputy Mayor for Housing on this front. So the Mayor put in some really key principles around what his expectation is about the deal for Londoners with government on both affordable housing and social housing. And as I said, those negotiations are still going on, and we're still waiting for the London housing deal, and we're optimistic that after the announcements about 5 billion or more for house building, that London's going to get a big slug of that, and a lot of that will go into delivering the Mayor's priorities and support boroughs in making sure that the most needy and the most vulnerable communities, and including those who are reliant on social housing and in benefits, are looked after. And there has been a bit of a deal which we hope is followed through, where, for example, on council house disposals, that we get a London deal where we get 2 replacement for the loss of 1 council house sale, and also whether that translates into people that are genuinely in housing need and in some cases on benefits getting access to that housing, and we don't get a sanitisation of social housing and social mix, and the government needs the Mayor as much as the other way round, actually, because London's got the greatest housing need in the country, and what makes London function in terms of its diverse communities and tenures is that range of people, from the people that are on benefits, who are on working benefits, that keep London running 24/7. These are the people that are often working in offices and cleaning and security and nursing and policing and teachers, and these are the people that the mayor's very focused on to make sure they get the right sort of housing, the right support, and that in new development that they get a good deal as well. So we're working with boroughs and government to make sure that people across the whole tenure range have got a choice and offer for housing, and that's going to be a big challenge because unless we start building more homes and we get the funding for more social and affordable housing, which we hope will make an announcement which is positive in that respect, then the most vulnerable are the most squeezed, and the mayor's determined to try and reverse that.
Yes, James Dinwiddie, I'm an architect. Just staying on the housing theme, is there evidence that some of the housing that's being provided, particularly I'm thinking about the Battersea Power Station development in Vauxhall, is actually helping to meet the target of 50,000 dwellings per year? As this property is being, I understand, brought up by foreign investment as buy-to-lets or whatever. And the second sort of link to that is that kind of property suitable for meeting the needs of families and the people who are going to stay in, really, and contribute to London?
That's always the challenging question. I think what's really important is to understand those big projects like 9 Elms Battersea. There's 25,000, I think it's 20,000 homes under construction, predicated on a Northern Line extension, which hasn't opened yet, so it's quite interesting. And there's been a lot of criticism about the type of housing for the wrong parts of London's housing need. And particularly being picked up by buy-to-let and foreign investors. In reality, I haven't got the statistics, but this is very much a focus on central London, like those sorts of locations, and as an overall housing contribution, it's actually quite a small percentage of mainstream housing development. So it gets all the headlines and the Evening Standard and the political tweetings, but actually for London as a whole, last time I looked, it was about 6%. But that doesn't mean it's not a problem for those central London areas. The mayor's been quite clear with a 50% affordable housing policy that he wants to make sure that all new developments make a bigger contribution across a wider range of affordable housing. Of course, that means that where there is going to be the most expensive housing, that is always going to attract wealthy people and international investors. London's an international city. The big issue is, are we building enough of the right type of housing in those locations? But I think what you can also remember that whatever your view is, whether it's a critical one of foreign investors buying luxury housing, the top of the skyscrapers along the South Bank, a lot of those developments also make significant contributions to affordable housing and off-site affordable housing. I'm not going to justify every one, but often it is the case that they will make a contribution. So Battersea Power Station has accelerated in one single development its entire affordable housing delivery on the back of its contribution towards the Section 106 agreement of its planning approval, and it's building 400 to 500 affordable housing units separately from the actual Battersea Power Station itself, and that will be delivered 3 or 4 years in advance of what was expected in their phasing programme. And also some boroughs are now getting into interesting discussions where they take an off-site contribution, So Southwark Council has got an interesting approach where it's identified its council estates. It's, for example, the Aylesbury or the Haygate, and it's taking the Section 106 contribution from, say, Berkeley Homes at Blackfriars with a luxury skyscraper on the river, £29 million, and they're investing in getting 5 times more affordable housing in places like the Aylesbury, in Peckham and other parts of the borough. So it's getting more bang for its buck in terms of affordable housing. So we've got to be creative, but we've also, the point you're making is we've got to build the right houses for all of Londoners, not just one end of the market.
Okay, one last question. Yeah.
My question's about the London plan and whether or not speak on, or you are going to actually put something about older people into it, because there is a market which is widely under providing for, and also will unlock an awful lot of housing provision, and it can actually live high rise and it can help you live in high density situations. And then just the issue about whether or not your statistics separate out housing for people. I thought you had care homes, but not the housing.
Yeah.
Probably a bit specific.
No, we do track that. We look at sheltered housing and things like that, and I think it's an interesting point that actually there is a real potential there to. At the moment, a lot of people are. That focus has been on staying in the family home. People have wanted to do that, and I think actually one of the challenges at the moment, we have started to see a rise in sheltered accommodation that has been picking up, and it picks up with the wider housing market. Got more turnover. It's easier for people to cash in or whatever, trade down and move into sheltered accommodation. So economically, I think one of the challenges is going to be, if we are looking at perhaps a quieter housing market, is to try and make sure those opportunities are still there for people to do exactly that, because they can release sort of larger homes, family homes for people, and it could, they can move perhaps more centrally into, let's say, high-rise facilities or more higher density and much more comfortably as well. So I think it's a good point.
Yeah, just to follow on from that, I think the Mayor's very keen to get in his new London plan a big, strong emphasis on, in the housing chapter in particular, of the needs of older people housing, and also link that into his wider strategies around regeneration and estate regeneration and decant. And we're working with some interesting boroughs like Lambeth, who've been moving, looking at their whole housing estate and older people's housing and care homes and supported housing, and moving many of their older residents out of some of the redundant and less fit for purpose accommodation, working with private developers like Berkeley Homes and Barratt's, and getting them into special needs or sheltered housing or supported housing or extra care housing, and often into locations which are more accessible to town centres with all the facilities, and then releasing the local authority asset for more family housing and social housing and people who are more needy on benefits, as we heard earlier. And that's been quite an interesting model, and I think we're going to get more of that in the London plan, of which boroughs can come forward, and also an overarching target that we have currently to strengthen that there's about 3,500 homes a year we need for older people in London, and that's probably going to grow, and they're an important part of the London housing market and the London economy. And there was a really interesting study by the Mayor's Design Advisory Group. There are four studies, in fact, but the one on older people housing is worth a really good read. It's just a little booklet that came out before the elections, and have a read of that on some really innovative solutions. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for those, and I'm sure on your behalf I'd like to thank again Stewart and Allan for what they've presented this evening. Now, we are inviting you all back down into the vaults. We've opened the other vault now, where there will be food and the most dangerous of things, a free bar. You're all welcome to come and join us. Both Stewart and Allan are sticking around, so I'm sure if there wasn't a question that you wanted to ask in an open forum, I'm sure you could ask it privately, or if there's anything you didn't get a chance to say. But all it remains for me is to say thank you very much for coming, and we retire downstairs for drinks and food. Thank you.